Well, let's speak about the state of newsrooms right now. And to help us do that is Media Monitoring Africa's William Bird. William, good evening to you and thank you very much for your time. The description around this is that newsrooms today are facing a global state of emergency. Is that an accurate characterization?
Well, I think broadly speaking, it probably is. I think that there are a few that are doing reasonably well in the current circumstances. But if you just look at our own media sector, broadcasting-wise, the broadcasters have been struggling, not just because of the business model, but because they're existing in a 20-year-old policy environment. Outside of that, you look at the public broadcaster, which is facing the possibility of a blackout because of the fact that their funding is just about non-existent. Again, in no small thanks to a funding crisis. And then you look at a lot of our other media, they're correct. The number of journalists in South Africa has just continued to shrink increasingly. And at the same time, you've seen increasing levels of distrust in news media. So it's a perfect storm for our journalists and news organizations, and not just in South Africa, but broadly speaking in many countries around the world.
Distrust is a word you use. Is that part of the reason perhaps there could be a reluctance to fund independent journalism?
I think mistrust certainly, and not just in journalism, but you've seen a decline in trust. If you look at some of these various trust barometers, you'll see that trust in many democratic institutions, again, globally, is significantly low. You've got governments that haven't lived up to their various promises, that are failing the people that they tend or seek to represent. So you've got key institutions that are failing. And then you've seen a significant rise of a kind of an anti-rights-based movement and a significant rise of a more authoritarian approach to media. And that says, we've got social media. We don't need these news media. They just lie all the time, or they're just biased, or they're fake news. When your former president of the United States started that as a general call to deflect from his many wrongdoings, it was something that gained a lot of traction, and we're seeing to varying degrees similar efforts in South Africa. And all of these things kind of combine to breed mistrust. And so journalists operate in an environment where, to a degree, they're going to necessarily not be liked by some people, especially those in power, because they're going to, at varying points of their careers, expose them for wrongdoing more often than not.
William, what becomes the role of media owners, particularly institutions that are independently owned? And I ask this because surely there is a way to try and reverse this, or could it be that they themselves are struggling to look for avenues or sources of funding?
Certainly we know that many of them are struggling for funding. Again, it's not unusual. And what media owners have tended to do for decades is whenever things start to get tough, you lay off people. And ironically, that's the thing that gives them their power now, their credibility and their ability to do good journalism, which means you need more people now rather than less. So they've kind of been shooting themselves in the foot over the last few decades, actually, because they haven't been building up their credibility and continuing to build that level of trust. And now they've in a place where many of them are having to have fewer journalists report on more and more and trying to do things. So again, it's about then saying, well, what kind of a business model do we need? So to some degree, this has got a positive spin-off. You've seen entities like Daily Maverick that have said, well, we're going to try something different, and they have. And, to a degree, they're a lot more successful than most of our other news organizations. We've seen entities like Newzroom Afrika springing up. Again, those are being supported by entities like MultiChoice. If MultiChoice is suddenly taken over by Canal Plus, what does that mean for news organizations like Newzroom Afrika? There's a real threat, and that's precisely because it's not that Newzroom Afrika isn't delivering huge value. It is, clearly. different perspectives, different journalists, different focus. All of those things are what you need in a democracy. But if your economic model just isn't sustainable, then it's going to continue to exist on that precarious balance. So if you accept that you want diverse, credible, verifiable, professional journalism as part of a democracy and democratic state, then you have to say we need to find ways of making sure that those formats are sustainable and are able to do their job to the extent that they need to.
Final question to you, William. You've spoken of the authoritarian approach towards journalism, and we've certainly seen attacks on individual journalists using social media platforms. Do you think there is an appreciation of what journalism is about by people out there, and perhaps the risk of not having independent journalists who can uncover difficult stories, but stories that must be told?
Yeah, there's that expression, you don't know what you've got till it's gone, and that's a very similar thing with news organizations, which I think was precisely the point the Daily Maverick was seeking to highlight by doing this, So I think that certainly the value and importance of what journalists do on a daily basis is undervalued by the general public. At the same time, we have to be realistic and acknowledge that the general public, many of them have a negative view of journalists because they've had a negative experience, or because sometimes media have not covered themselves in glory. So there's a lot of work that news organizations and the general public have to do. But it's not just the general public that needs to support our media. You're needing big entities that need to come on board, and you need those entities that have been making money off that, and indeed rewarding undermining our information environment. So that's what big tech companies have been doing. They've been making money off news organizations, off their information, and they've been conversely rewarding mis and disinformation. So there's a fundamental imbalance that's occurring at the moment, and we need to find a way of addressing that, making sure that the big tech companies pay, and this is again a principle that we're seeing occurring across the world. But at the same time, we need news organizations to play their part and be professional and adhere to the highest standards of ethical journalism. And the other institutions of democracy must do their parts. In as much as we might say there's a lot that media has to do, which is true, we need our other democratic institutions to function. So it doesn't help that you've got a global decline in trust in many of your key entities like Parliament and your general government services.
William Bird from Media Monitoring Africa, thank you very much for your time.